DC really is the scene. It's underappreciated, I think, in many regards. I think we think of tech and we automatically go to Silicon Valley, but I mean, there's some really great tech hotspots out there. I mean, of course, New York is, another, really burgeoning hot tech scene. When you really think about what could or could not happen with the future of the technology, I mean, that really sits here.
Why does DC have a unique place in the responsible AI governance discussion? John Heflin Hopkins-Gillespie, Director of Product and Policy at Trustible AI, joins the show to discuss that question and more. In this episode of DC Decoded, I, Sam Lee, get to chat with John about what responsible AI governance really means, why the US is charting a more independent AI path compared to the rest of the world, and why DC should be considered a tech hotbed. Let's get going. Welcome back to DC Decoded, a Gen AI podcast where we break down what happens when artificial intelligence meets the nation's capital. I'm your host, Sam Lee, part of the Gen AI DC chapter. Today, we'll be talking with John Heflin Hopkins-Gillespie. John is currently the Director of Policy and Product Counsel at Trustible AI, advising the company on AI regulatory developments and overseeing legal compliance issues for the Trustible platform. Previously, he worked on cybersecurity incident response as an associate at Alston & Bird, and on privacy, data security, IP, and AI at Wilkinson Barker Knauer. John serves as co-president of the DC LGBTQ+ Bar Association and the executive committee Freedom Fund chair for the NAACP Alexandria Branch 7043. He was recognized by the Washington Business Journal as one of the 2024 LGBTQ+ business leaders and received his JD from Georgetown University and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Marquette University. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Sam. And I appreciate you getting through my name. I know it's quite a mouthful.
No worries at all. So, John, how do you define artificial intelligence or AI?
Yeah, well, I'll start off by saying if I knew exactly how to define it, I'd probably be a millionaire because isn't that like the million or billion dollar question? So, I think the best analogy that I can give on a definition is Supreme Court Justice Stewart, when asked to define obscenity in the context of pornography, said, "I know it when I see it." And funny enough, I was telling my husband, that was the answer I was going to give because, in the space, I think it resonates with a lot of people. And he very smartly said to me, "But it's artificial intelligence. You don't see it." And I was like, well, yes, that's true. You don't literally see the machines at work. It's more of a figurative analogy. But I think the real meaning, behind I know it when I see it, and I think the phrase is apt when describing it, because if you really talk to, different personas, industry, academia, policymakers, if you're talking to different personas, you really are going to get a wide range of answers of what exactly AI is. And so I think we've kind of coalesced around using the term interoperably with algorithms and predictive systems and automated decision-making systems and machine learning. And, there's an umbrella of different functions and features and tools that fall within the scope of, artificial intelligence. But I think if we're really trying to understand what it is, we have to be really precise in understanding, what is the task that we're trying to accomplish. And going from there, we can figure out what exactly we should be using in terms of terminology. So it's a question that I think everyone is struggling with. Again, I think you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. I think if lawmakers understood how to define AI, we'd be in a very different position. There is a federal definition of AI. There's a definition of artificial intelligence for the EU AI Act. NIST, uses a definition of AI that kind of coalesced between the federal it uses the federal definition, but it's also acknowledged other definitions from standards bodies and other nonprofit and intergovernmental organizations. But yeah, I think if we could answer that question, we could end this podcast now and go enjoy retirement.
Right. So there's a lot to talk about, is what I'm hearing. Well, let's niche down a little bit, specifically with what you've been working on for the past several years now. How would you define responsible AI governance? How would you define that term?
So here's how I think about it, right? And I've talked to a few people who've made this really apt analogy about, when cars came into society and they became widespread. And you think about it from, any kind of product or service development. For me, it's thinking through what are the risks, what are the benefits, and how do we do our best to minimize the risks while maximizing the benefits. So when we're thinking about responsible AI, we need to think about how is the system being applied, right? Is it being applied as a product? Is it being applied as a service? How are people interacting with it? And then, tease out what exactly are the risks that come from the intended use or the intended purpose of the system. And then, be intentional about the benefits. I think, we oftentimes get lost in the pitfalls of how these systems can detrimentally impact us. And we don't think enough about benefits. And at Trustible, we're trying to work on, weighing the risks of systems that enterprises are using and deploying with the benefits and helping to kind of realize, in both verbiage and dollar amounts, what that looks like. And when you're thinking about responsible AI development, it really is, to me, how can we minimize the risks and maximize the benefits?
Right. Minimizing risks, maximizing benefits. Were these things you were already thinking about when you were a poli-sci major at Marquette? Were these things coming up during law school? When did you personally start feeling like this was something maybe worth pursuing as a career?
So I will tell you, so I was in undergrad from '08 to 2012. And, around the time I graduated, about 21 or 22, I struggled with understanding how Google Docs and Google Forms worked. So it's really kind of a sweet poetic justice moment that my career post law school is in emerging technology. But it really starts with when I graduated. I worked in politics. I worked two campaigns. Actually, I worked more than two campaigns, but I worked two big campaigns, and then I went and worked for the state government. I worked for Governor Terry McAuliffe when he was in office from 2013 to 2018, or 2014 to 2018. I'm sorry. And I was his personal aide body guy. For the DC folks that are listening to understand what that means. And one of his big initiatives when he was involved with the National Governors Association was cybersecurity and how do we build modern, resilient networks and infrastructure to secure taxpayer data. And, it was really shocking to me, having not really explored the topic much, to learn how antiquated and outdated these infrastructures or networks were, but how vital they were to people's lives. You're talking about people who are receiving benefits or healthcare or need government services, and these systems are just outdated and ripe for exploitation. And, so his initiative was trying to modernize the Virginia state networks, but also kind of rallying the troops when he was in charge of the National Governors Association to get other governors on board with, modernizing their networks. And it really got me thinking about, at the time I was trying to figure out what to do post administration. Virginia governors get one term. And I, decided at that point to go to law school, but I was thinking about, what would a good outcome be for me in law school and post law school? And so that was really where I got bitten by the bug when it came to emerging technologies and thinking about, the forefront of these issues, whether it's cyber, privacy, biometrics, AI, these are all the things of the future that are going to make life easier, more equitable, more accessible for people, but it comes with an enormous amount of risk. And for me, thinking about what would be a worthwhile legal career, that was what propelled me through law school is to focus on emerging technology issues. Georgetown has a wonderful curriculum. It's robust. So I gobbled up as many tech classes as I could. Worked my schedule. I worked during law school, so I worked my schedule. So if there was a class I really wanted to take, I could take it.
Yeah.
And that was really what pushed me in the direction. So when I came out of law school, I knew that wherever I was gonna land, firm, nonprofit, animal, mineral, vegetable, right? Wherever I was landing, this was the space I wanted to be in. And so that's just really guided my career,
Right.
before law school until now.
Right. And for those who might not know, what is Trustible AI, the place you work at now as Director of Policy and Product Counsel? What is Trustible AI doing?
So Trustible is a software for a service platform. And, what I love about our startup, it's a startup, and what I love about our mission is that, we're helping companies operationalize what can sometimes be the amorphous concept of AI governance. I think the term has become one of those buzz terms over the past year, 6 months or so, where, now there's a push here. We've got to have AI governance. But almost similar to what is AI, it's an apt question to ask, what is AI governance? And so, you know, our job at Trustable is to help automate and operationalize various frameworks, standards, whether it's regulatory, like the EU AI Act, whether it's guiding frameworks like NIST, whether it's policy positions or toolkits that are out there, like we see in Singapore, right? We're taking all of these different touch points and trying to put them into a platform. So when, our customers, our prospective customers are trying to wrap their heads around how do we understand where AI is being used in our organization? How do we understand the risks? How do we understand the benefits? How do we understand our corporate governance structures around AI? Trustable is there to fill those gaps and help accelerate AI adoption. What we're finding with our customers is when there are robust systems, procedures, policies in place, when you have components that make up, your AI governance, depending on your size and scale, what we're finding is, companies, orgs, they're more willing to adopt and deploy AI technologies internally, externally, because there's trust that's being built into their ecosystems around the tools. Our CEO calls us the TurboTax of AI governance, which I think is great because I think it really kind of helps analogize like what exactly we do. And it is, and we look at it through the lens of responsible AI. So I love that you asked, what do you think of when you think of responsible AI? Because, it's not just thinking through operationalizing AI governance. It's thinking about how can we be responsible with the design, the development, the deployment, the retirement of tools across an enterprise.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And for our listeners who might not know, can you just spell out what NIST stands for?
Yeah, so NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It sits under the Department of Commerce. It is not a regulatory agency, a policy setting agency that while it does have standards in their name, they don't actually prescribe standards, but they do set out very, very good, very detailed policy guidance on emerging technology issues across so many different topics from cybersecurity to privacy to AI.
Right. Okay. Good to know for anybody who might not know that. On the topic of frameworks, as somebody who works in this field, do you see frameworks trending specifically around AI governance towards more so coalescing among a few frameworks that apply to like a wide range of companies and organizations? Or is it the opposite with how fast AI is evolving and changing? Our frameworks splintering into more and more case by case bases? Where are we right now in terms of the direction of these frameworks? Is it more or less?
I'm going to give you my favorite attorney answer. It depends.
Sure.
And it's so true. So, there are a lot of players in this space. And so when you think about what entity you're dealing with, that's going to dictate, where the framework is going. So I'll give you some examples. The US, of course, is the most exceptional nation in the history of nations, right? And so we're looking at, what does oversight in AI mean through the lens of, the American experience. And so, we want to be in the driver's seat on these issues. And so, we will consider, whatever administration is in place, we'll look to potentially align with how our international partners are looking. But we also have this spin to it where we want to be the ones kind of dictating the tone and the cadence of what that looks like. So, Congress, specifically the Senate, but the House also did some work on this over the last couple of years, have really dug into what does a responsible AI regulatory framework potentially look like. And so there's somewhat of an agreement between the House and the Senate. And if you really want to talk about trying to get people on the same page, get the House and the Senate on the same page. And that's a challenge in and of itself. But there's a coalescing around the idea, at least in the US, that when it comes to regulating AI or thinking about AI regulations, there's existing law and then there's gaps that can be filled by new law. And so that's how, Congress has been thinking about a potential framework. When we look at NIST, they look at AI through the lens of risk. And so, NIST has the AI risk management framework. And so they're looking at how are organizations able to have programs, policies, procedures in place that address risk with AI systems, right? And it's just risk focused, and AI governance is, more than just thinking about it through risk. There's a lot of different things. Risk kind of runs through it all, but they're really focused on the high risk aspect of it. When you look at the EU, they're looking at it from a consumer protection, consumer transparency, tech regulatory lens. It's kind of a conglomeration of a few different concepts there. And, I think some of the thought leadership around the EU AI Act has been, Europe has tried to, or the EU has tried to not make some of the same mistakes that we saw with GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that governs data privacy in the EU. I think, there's been thought that that's what they've tried to do, and yet there's, some pretty heavy criticism about, how far the act goes, how prescriptive it is. It really does look at AI through the lens of product safety, consumer safety, tech regulation. So you have a few different models out there about, what does reining in AI look like? What does oversight look like? And there's some alignment. There's some concerted efforts to be aligned, but everyone's kind of, each of the actors are kind of putting their own spin on what that looks like.
Right. So let's stay on DC for a second. What
Okay.
AI regulations or discussions happening in Congress or other political bodies should businesses be paying attention to right now? Like what is going on?
There has been a pretty big pivot since January 20th
Right.
on what that looks like.
Right.
And so I think, under the Biden administration, there was, I think, more alertness to what could potentially come down the pipe in terms of any federal action on AI. Now, there are plenty of people who will say, if you can tell me about AI regs that are coming out of Congress, I've got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. Because there's not a lot of faith in sometimes what our Congress folks can get across the finish line. But, I do think that had we had a Democratic administration, there probably would have been some light touch rules that had come out to kind of clarify certain laws with maybe some stopgap measures in between to, cover things that weren't necessarily covered by existing federal law. That has completely changed. And so I think what we're seeing now in DC at the federal level is a push for more experimentation, more innovation, more proactive AI arms race development, right? Because that's really, in my opinion, how the Trump administration is looking at the realm of AI. We are in a global race with economic competitors from China, from India, potentially now from Europe, and we need to be number one in that race. And so much as we can keep the regulators at bay and let tech go forward and develop and push the boundaries of the technology. I think that's what they're doing. And because Congress is, both houses are controlled by Republicans, I think that mantra is ringing true. And so, on the federal level, I think that probably less to be concerned about. I don't have a crystal ball for starters, and I have been known to be wrong in the past. So you never know, Congress could surprise us. I think honestly, the thing that we should be keeping an eye on, and this is, I think, apt and a little bit closer to home, is what's happening at the state level. And right now, like in Virginia, there's a Colorado style bill that's just passed the General Assembly. I think it just passed out of the General Assembly last week, and it's on Governor Youngkin's desk now, and not a lot of foresight into whether or not he signs it. But that's really where we should be looking right now, because states are moving forward on these issues. Colorado's passed their bill. Connecticut tried to pass a very similar style bill last year, and I think they're going to try to do it again. There's a consumer protection bill up in the New York State legislature. There's sector-specific pieces of legislation peppered across some states. I think New Mexico and Washington have some pretty big AI bills that they're looking at in their state legislature. So, they say all politics is local. And I think this is a really great example of how, we're seeing a message from the federal level about, what innovation looks like. And I think you're seeing at the state level, okay, well, we're going to be labs of democracy and experiment with some of these rules and see what works and what doesn't work. And I completely forgot this, but Texas is also trying to stake their claim on AI rules and has a bill in their legislature that it's a Republican sponsored bill. I'd be shocked if it doesn't make it across the finish line, because I think they're trying to be a leader in the space as well, and
Right.
they're trying to attract tech companies. So I think they're thinking about this too. But yeah, the state level, honestly, I know everybody in DC wants to know what's going on in DC, but really a lot of the action right now in the US is percolating at the state level.
And what do you make of these state level bills? Like on average, what do you think these bills are getting right versus what could be concerning if implemented?
So my chief concern is similar to what we've seen with cybersecurity and privacy, is that you once again get a patchwork of legislation, laws, where there's just enough difference between states that you have to have a completely separate process to deal with a component of a state law, right? And so what works in California, maybe 70% of it will work in Virginia, but there's like that 25% that's specific to the state of Virginia that you got to do. Or there's the 25% that's specific to the state of New York, and the Commonwealth of Virginia. Let me correct myself, the Commonwealth of Virginia. But there's the 25% that's unique to the state of New York, and you've got to figure that piece out. And so really that's where you start getting into some issues when it comes to what are we trying to do with the rules, right? Are we trying to be responsible with the ecosystem and help develop trust and safety for these products? Or is this becoming a check the box regulatory exercise that every state wants to put their unique spin on? And so that's really the pitfall. It's not which state's right, which state's wrong. It's really thinking about, is this the right approach to where we have, 50 states coming up with 50 different things? And, having seen it with, incident response work, I'll say it's messy. And, when you have a breach and you're talking about a multi-jurisdictional breach with multiple state laws involved, I think the people who are affected by the bad thing, in this case, a malicious actor doing something to someone's system, but, we take to the AI context, if something happens with the AI system, right? It's really the consumers and, the public that gets left behind in these things because, I'm sure you've gotten notices in the mail from whomever that something's happened, there's been an incident, and you get free credit monitoring, but people have kind of become numb to that. And so, when we're thinking about who is the intended audience? What do we want as outcomes? And how do we want this to work in a way that actually builds trust in the ecosystem? We really need to take a step back and think about is a 50 state or a 25 state or however many states decide to get into this game when it comes to AI, is that the right approach? And is it really doing a service to, the intended audience?
Right. I want to close out this part of the discussion with a quick quote followed by a question. So as I was preparing for this episode, I found this Stephen Hawking quote, and with I think all famous figure quotes, it's 50% chance it was actually them who said it. But I think he wrote this one down in an article. So I feel more confident saying it was the Stephen Hawking. But before he passed, this was the mid-2010s, he stated that artificial intelligence is likely to be either the best or worst thing to happen to humanity. And the regulations, this is now outside the quote, AI regulations probably will just continue to be part of that conversation. So in your opinion, what is missing in today's AI regulations to ensure that it's more likely to be one of the better things to happen to humanity rather than the opposite?
Yeah. So let me kind of take this at a higher level, and I'll tell you, it was really one of the reasons that I wanted to join Trustible, specifically, when I was going through the interview process. So, Trustible brands itself as a company that looks at AI through the lens of AI pragmatism, and I completely agree with that lens of thinking, right? Where there's obviously extremes on both sides where there's AI dystopia and there's AI utopia. But really, when we think about, how the technology should be used and how it should be deployed and how it should be overseen, it really is a balance between unlocking innovation that can help people, right? This is personal for me in thinking that AI can really be a tool that unlocks potential for underrepresented communities. But at the same time, with anything, right? I mentioned, with cars, right? There needs to be common sense guardrails that are set up so that way, the tools, the technologies, the systems are, being put out into the public in a way that doesn't harm people, or if there is harm, it can be minimized or give people a recourse, to fix and right how they've been wronged, by these systems. And so, when I think about what rules and legislation can look like, the principle should really be what is common sense, right? When we get all of the stakeholders in the room, when we get industry in the room, we get academia in the room, and we have the ear of policymakers, how can we strike a good balance between good ideas? Because there's a lot of good ideas, among these different stakeholder groups. There's also a lot of bad ideas among these stakeholder groups. And so, when we get into rooms and we have these conversations, how can we kind of go for the Goldilocks of making sure that companies, and, I'm not really talking about the big players. I'm talking about, creating an ecosystem where the entry barriers are low enough that if you, Sam, have an idea for a tool that can improve people's credit scores, right? And, help them do that, or have a healthcare idea, right? You have the potential to get into the ecosystem without having to worry about cumbersome rules and regs and paperwork and filing. But at the same time, there's stability in the rules that exist. So when you enter the field, okay, my hands aren't going to be tied behind my back. But there's just some common sense things that are out there that I have to do to make sure that the idea that I have that could be the next big thing, isn't going to have, rippling negative consequences for, society, for certain communities. So, that's how I think about it is, it's not what's good, what's bad. It's what works, right? What works? Define the problem you're trying to solve, and then figure out what are some common sense rules that we can have to make that outcome possible.
The last area I want to touch on is the more international perspective, especially as you bring up frameworks and stuff that the EU is doing, for example. So what is America's current relationship with the rest of the world on AI right now? And is it different from how we approach other more international issues like climate issues or defense spending, for example. Where are we at with the rest of the world on
If this was a Facebook status, it's complicated would probably be the best way to describe it. So, nothing exists in a vacuum. And so just like all of our other geopolitical priorities, AI is influenced by a number of different things. And so on one hand, the US wants to be the leader, right? Like we want the technology made here. We want the chips made here. We want the talent to be here. In the same breath, we, under the Trump administration are trying to chart a unique American path that, if maybe the rest of the world has agreed on a particular topic, we are not necessarily feeling beholden to the rest of the world in respect to signing on to it. And, I'll give you an example. At the Paris AI Action Summit a couple of weeks ago, there was a joint declaration that was signed by every country that was participating except the US and the UK. And there were some language issues around it and, what was included and what was not included. And, I think in maybe a different lifetime or a different decade, the idea that America would walk away from something as consequential as a joint statement that the rest of the world, including China, who, is an economic competitor in this AI arms race, right, is signed on to the idea that the US walking away from that would be slightly unfathomable, right? And so I think there is a certain level of comfortability to do things in a way that isn't necessarily comporting with how the rest of the world is viewing the issue. Now, that being said, the mantra of innovation is starting to really ripple around the globe. And so what you didn't see in Paris is probably just as loud as what you saw. And what you didn't see in Paris is a focus on AI safety. And that is at odds with where we were in the last global summit when the UK hosted it. And it was literally called the UK AI Safety Summit. And, Paris was the AI Action Summit. And so, France, Germany, Italy have voiced concerns over AI innovation in the EU for a number of years now, particularly around the negotiations with the EU AI Act. And, it would appear that those concerns are starting to win out when it comes to how the EU is thinking about, AI development, AI innovation, tech companies, because you're starting to see a pivot toward the same innovation focus that's happening here in the US. France wants to be a leader in this. And so, they want to be a player on the global stage when it comes to standards and the technology. They have Minstrel, but I think they want more. And so, they are putting up, I forgot the exact amount of euro in AI investment. They're putting it together with, a public-private partnership to invest more. But I mean, the EU writ large is also investing, I believe, like 100 million euro or something to that tune in AI as well. So, so much as America is kind of charting its own course, it is also kind of leading a pack in some way. And that is really pivoting toward AI innovation, tech innovation, deprioritizing some of the safety aspects of AI. And the next summit is, I think it's expected to be in India. I believe they're bidding for the next AI summit. And India has said they want to be a leader on this. They want to be an innovation hub as well. They want to, train and retain talent. And I would be really shocked if there's much emphasis on AI safety in the next summit, especially if India is holding it. The Modi government is been, very forthright on where they see themselves in this paradigm of AI development and, the AI ecosystem from a policy perspective. So yeah, it's complicated. It really is. And, what kind of looms over all of this, and I know I've been on a roll with this, so I'll end with this. What looms over all of this, of course, is the global competition between China and the US, right? Almost everything can be kind of viewed through that lens. It's, the biggest relationship on the planet. You think about the billions that go back and forth between these two economies when it comes to trade. And, whatever the US is doing, China's keeping a close eye on, and whatever China's doing, the US is keeping a close eye on. And, we saw what happened when DeepSeek was released, right? And the ripples that it had through, the US economy. And so, all the while that, we're thinking about this from like the US EU paradigm, we also have to think about it from what does this look like through, the US China paradigm, and how do these two countries kind of shape the debate and where they're shaping the debate, because China is playing in the global south, and that is just historically a part of the world that we've been super great with when it comes to investment in the way that the Chinese government is. So this could be a whole other podcast that we could talk
For
about,
sure, for sure.
breaking down these different priorities across different international factions. But yeah, I will leave it at that with the thought bubble around the U.S. China relationship.
Yeah, and that's what happens when you talk about AI increasingly. It touches on every other important issue in a way that I think few other topics do. Last question for you. What do you think makes the developments around AI in DC unique compared to other places? I guess with our conversation, both other places in the US, but also around the world.
Yeah. So, when we think about the DC ecosystem, right? This is where decisions are being made, right? Or lack thereof decision. Not everything has to have an end, right? Like, Congress not doing something is just as impactful as Congress doing something. And at the end of the day, this is where the people who make decisions are. And so, I think back to the West Wing, and it's, talking about decisions are made by people who are in the room. And, this is where the decisions are made. So you want to be in the room, right? And so it's really in everyone's interest in the tech ecosystem and the AI ecosystem, regardless of size, scale, purpose, big tech company, tech nonprofit, civil rights advocacy groups, right? Like everyone has a vested interest to be in the room, helping to shape decisions or making the case for not doing anything at all. And so that's what I think makes DC unique. We've got great educational institutions, all around the DMV area. The center of political power is here. It's also the lawyer capital of the world. So, I mean, when you're thinking about how AI can be impacted and, how development can be impacted, that starts with, do we have rules in place? Do we have agencies that are going to enforce existing rules? Are we going to get guidance on how these rules apply or don't apply? Are there going to be court cases being filed and, the DC circuit, right? Like these are all things that happen here. So, there's a reason why all of the big tech companies have outlets here. There's a reason why the tech startup scene is blossoming in DC. People understand the value of being here with all of the talent, with the access to, political power that's here. DC really is the scene. It's underappreciated, I think, in many regards. I think we think of tech and we automatically go to Silicon Valley, but I mean, there's some really great tech hotspots out there. I mean, of course, New York is, another, really burgeoning hot tech scene. When you really think about what could or could not happen with the future of the technology, I mean, that really sits here because you have a major incident, lawmakers are going to react, right? They have constituents that may be impacted by these, negative consequences. And so, when bad things happen, lawmakers tend to sit up at attention and start doing something, which that's a debate for another day, is whether or not that should be the posture. But it tends to happen, right? And so, something bad happens where there's a major AI incident, right? Like that will grab the attention of these folks. And if you're not here and you're not in the room and you're not making your case, then your voice isn't going to be heard, right? So that's, for me, looking at why DC is important in the tech ecosystem, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about, the rules, the decision makers, the court cases, like that's here.
Right. Right. Well, John, that was great. Thank you again for your time. I hope we're able to create the best AI regulations, both federal level and state level and abroad, just everywhere in general.
Great.
And I hope business continues to boom for Trustible. But thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was a lot of fun. Thanks.
That's a wrap for this episode of DC Decoded. I want to thank John again for his time. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe to DC Decoded on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And if you found this discussion valuable, we'd love it if you left a rating or review. It helps others discover the show. For more on the DC chapter of the GenAI Collective, upcoming events, and ways to get involved, check out the links in the show description. If you're interested in collaborating, sponsoring, or just learning more, don't hesitate to reach out via the information in the show description. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in 2 Wednesdays for the next episode.